I'm Elliot Temple, a philosopher, and I'm going to be reading and analyzing Omnipotent Government, The Rise of the Total State and Total War by Ludwig von Mises. You can download the book for free. I'm only going to be going through my highlights. I already read the whole book. The book, it's from 1944, and it has to do with the Nazis and the prior history of Germany and relevant ideas leading up to the Nazis. It has a lot of content about liberalism, which is a political philosophy involving liberty. So it has things like property rights, free trade, limited government, and peace and reason, which is definitely not the system of the Nazis. So this is in the introduction, and Mises is saying something about how anti-liberals claim to be liberals, and they claim to be fulfilling the main ideas of liberalism, such as liberty. So I think this highlight is too small, so I'm going to read a bit more. They disparage private ownership of the means of production in the market economy, which are liberal ideas, and they're friends of totalitarian methods of economic management. They want government omnipotence. And they're in favor of measures to give more power to officials and government agencies. So the so-called liberals and progressives think they're true Democrats, but their idea is opposite the one from the 19th century. They confuse democracy with socialism. They don't see the incompatibility. So they do trade barriers, credit expansion, price control, minimum wages, subsidies. They use taxation for confiscation, expropriation, and redistribution rather than only to fund defense of life, property rights, and other basics. And they try to use government spending to increase welfare, which is not a liberal idea. So if you want to read more about that, you have the book. I will keep going to my next highlight. The leaders of Japan were imbued at European universities with the spirit of statism. He calls it etatism, which is a French word, if I remember right, that means statism. And he said something like he liked the different word because it's a foreign word, it's not an English word. And it's a foreign concept, not an English concept. However, as an English speaker, I usually just mentally translate it to statism. Let's see if we can find where he explains it originally. Nope. Oh, there's a footnote. The term etatism, from the French etat meaning state, he prefers to statism because it's not an Anglo-Saxon origination. But anyways, it means being in favor of state power and state control and that kind of thing, where every nation is eager to insulate itself and strive towards autarky, and there isn't economic freedom, and so on. Okay, let's see if we can find where I was. Introduction, second highlight. So he says that Japan was educated at European universities with the ideas of statism, and then they went home and revived the old idea that their divine emperor should rule all peoples. So with this atmosphere where people want to reconstruct the ancient Roman Empire or restore the domain of Philip II, or have the Japanese emperor rule the entire earth, there's no room left for peaceful cooperation. So remember, this book is from towards the end of World War II, when we were winning already, but before it was over. Currently, laissez-faire is not going to work in some ways, Mises says it would be equivalent to an unconditional surrender to the totalitarian nations. Because, for example, with migration barriers, if we allowed unrestricted migration, that would let Germans, Italians, and Japanese into the country, who would basically be the advanced troops of their invading army. So we have to have immigration restrictions against totalitarian countries. Today, a lot of Mises fans are open borders advocates because, in principle, liberalism prefers open borders. But Mises makes a couple comments in this book about limits on open borders because of the need for defense against invasion. And he says there's no sign that people of the West are prepared to abandon statism. And sadly, 75 years later, it's the same thing. Statism is going strong. Our government has gotten bigger, stronger, higher taxes. Well, actually, I'm not sure what tax rates were in 1944, but taxes have been going up as a trend. The left and the right are suspicious of freedom of thought. It's characteristic that British Soviet author champions Inquisition. Inquisition is beneficial to science when it protects a rising class. The danger or value of an inquisition depends on whether it is used on behalf of reactionary or a progressive class governing. So basically, inquisition is good if you're in power, says T.G. Crowther, a pro-Soviet British author. Mises responds, doctrines which can stand the trial of logic and reason can do without persecuting skeptics. Mises thinks if we had no other arguments for the Nazi doctrines, just the fact that they used the Gestapo instead of the lecture hall would condemn them. This is just like what Godwin said. When a doctrine uses police power or other violence, or threats of violence, that shows its inner weakness. It's a poor argument of my superior reason that I am unable to make justice be apprehended and felt without the intervention of blows. He pretends to punish me because his argument is strong, but really it's because it's weak. Because if he had a good argument, he would use it. If he who employs coercion against me could mold me to his purposes by argument, no doubt he would. So he's showing the weakness of his argument when he uses violence. The war was not caused by Nazism alone. Failure of other nations to stop the rise of Nazism was instrumental. Because the Nazis didn't keep their ambitions a secret. So the greatest responsibility for the problem lies with the doctrines and parties that have dominated the course of politics in the last decades. Because the Nazis were bad, but they said they were being bad, and people chose not to stop them. So, and we need better policies that can protect us against, having bad people in the world. There was a political problem to prevent the catastrophe of this war, and the politicians failed. The left thinks they know private property is the source of all ills, and public control of the means of production will transform the earth into a paradise. They blame the war on capitalism. But socialist and communist parties did things to encourage Nazi aggression, such as propagating disarmament doctrines and neutrality in the Allied countries. And the Soviets did even worse at preventing the war. Poland in 1938 annexed part of Czechoslovakia. And Belgium in 1936 severed ties of alliance with France. I just highlighted this because they're like interesting historical events that I wasn't familiar with. They're kind of ridiculous. They deserve pity, but they also brought some misfortune on themselves. The war wouldn't have happened if the Nazis expected to fight on day one a united and armed Great Britain, France, Russia, and US, plus the small democracies of Europe, all working together. But we didn't do that. It's not hostility to a nation to establish that its policies were wrong and resulted in disaster. It's not hostility to members of a class, pressure group, organization to point out where they were mistaken and how they have contributed to current problems. The task of social science is to defy taboo that try to protect established doctrines and their fallacies and their errors against criticism. It's nice. Mises is in favor of criticism, critical thinking, and not looking at things in a partisan way where you only criticize the other side and you try to defend your side. But you should... It's not a sign of hostility to criticize something that can be helping it improve. A lot of people say that but aren't very good at remembering it or acting on it or something. But I think Mises is actually good at it. He's a very objective thinker who does analysis well. German school teachers in the first decade of our century, so that would be 1900 to 1910, flogged small children whose parents objected to some sort of German slogans rather than Polish slogans in Prussia's Polish provinces. We're talking about the methods of Germans dealing with Poles. There's a bunch of arguing over whose ancestors were better, including forgeries. And they do this because it fits into their nationalist myths about what their nation is and its history. But instead of looking at these historical and geographical arguments, what we should consider is democratic government safeguards peace and international cooperation because it doesn't oppress the non-favored groups. So you don't have to struggle to be the one in charge based on the right of history or geography to, like, they're looking for arguments from history, geography, like famous historical figures and the nationality and language of those people for why they should be the ruler who gets to subjugate other people, nations, local inhabitants of an area, etc. Whereas democracy tries not to oppress people. Like, it's a system where no one in the area gets oppressed. So that works better than arguing over who has, like, the historical or geographical right to rule. So Mises gives an example of a bigot. Senor Salvador de Madariaga. Scholar, statesman, writer. Familiar with English and French languages and literature. Democrat, progressive. League of Nations supporter. In favor of peace. But his opinions on political problems are extremely biased by nationalism. He condemns the demands of Catalans and Basques for independence, but advocates Castilian hegemony for racial, historical, geographical, linguistic, religious, and economic reasons. So he just wants his group to rule and has a bunch of excuses. When other groups want independence and to rule themselves and possibly other people, he doesn't like it, but for his own group, he's super biased and nationalist. And the only reason, or maybe not only, but he says the reason that Portugal shouldn't be, like, conquered by Spain too is that Isabel married Ferdinand instead of Alfonso, which is not a good way to organize nations. All right, part 1, the collapse of German liberalism. Chapter 1, German liberalism. Section 1, the Ancien Regime and liberalism, which means the ancient regime, the previous or older regime from before some modern changes. So we're going to go back in time well before 1944. Okay, so Mises says it's a mistake to think Nazism continues old policies from the ancient regime and the Prussian spirit. And actually, Nazism is something new and different rather than return to historical stuff. It doesn't come from Frederick William I or Frederick II the Great, called Frederick the Great. It doesn't try to restore the policy of the electors of Brandenburg and the first four kings of Prussia. Nazis have different goals. It doesn't try to restore something from the past, but establish something new and unheard of. At the end of the 1700s, from Western Europe, new ideas got to Germany. People are used to blindly obey God-given authority of the princes, and they heard the words liberty, self-determination, rights of man, parliament, constitution. And they started to learn about those words. Now, I highlighted this. No German has contributed anything to the elaboration of the great system of liberal thought, which has transformed the structure of society and replaced the rule of kings and royal mistresses by the government of the people. The philosophers, economists, and sociologists who developed it thought and wrote in English or French. In the 18th century, the Germans did not even succeed in achieving readable translations of these English, Scotch, and French authors. So that was notable about how bad Germany was intellectually and how different it was, and that Germany is not the same thing as France. They get grouped together today quite a bit by Americans who don't know a lot about them. And they've perhaps gained some similarities in recent years post-World War II. But the historical traditions of their cultures are very different. There's a lot of great French liberal authors like Bastiat and Turgot, and Germany doesn't have that. And it's not just like a few good names. There's many, many lesser known names from France and England, but not Germany, who advocated liberal ideas and developed them. It's not entirely French and English. There was some good work in Spanish and Italian, I think. Not as much, but some. Maybe even like Dutch. I'm not too sure about that. Probably, though. And of course, some of those thinkers wrote in Latin because it was that long ago. Or maybe a lot of them did, actually. Yeah, thinking about the time frames. I don't know how much of it was actually written in like Spanish or Italian as against Latin. But some of the liberal ideas date back to Rome, like private property and free trade were ideas that existed in Rome. And they also, democracy goes back to Greece. If you want to know about the history of liberalism, I'm reading a really good book. So I recommend this book, An Austrian Perspective on the History of Economic Thought. It's long and it's detailed, so you can just look up time periods you're interested in and like skip parts and just, if you want to know about like a few of the early French liberals, you just go to the chapter on that time period dealing with France and just skim around, find a few people's names like Fenelon or whoever else, and read a little bit. You don't have to just read the book straight through. Whoever rose from misery and joined the community of civilized men became a liberal. Except for a small group of princes and aristocratic retainers, practically everyone interested in political issues was liberal. There were in Germany in those days only liberal men and indifferent men. So this is specifically about Germany. He's saying basically everyone who started thinking and becoming less ignorant, aside from like a few of the rulers, became a liberal. There were like the ignorant, indifferent masses, and there were the people who knew something about ideas and favored liberalism. That was what it was like in those days, which is, well, he says sympathize with the French Revolution. That was around 1790. But they scorned the terrorism of the Jacobins, which means French Revolution people. But they approved the Great Reform. That's questionable, by the way, because the French Revolution fucked up a lot. But it did claim to be inspired by reason and liberal values. They thought Napoleon would bring reform, and then they disliked him when he made himself emperor. So not as wise as Burke, who opposed the revolution early and wrote against it. And Burke was a liberal, not some other sort of opponent. So the German people had never been united before. They hadn't had a spiritual movement that took hold of the whole country. So they became a German nation when they received the liberal ideas from the West of freedom and property rights and free trade and so on. Then there became something that had never existed before, a German public opinion, a German literature, instead of only a few elites having things like literature and opinions. The masses had some of those things. Now, this disrupted the traditional loyalty and subservience that the princes were used to. Germans now dreamed of parliamentary government and rights for the individuals, rather than just being slaves of princes. The patriots, a newfangled term imported from France, despised those seats of despotic misrule and abuse, the princes. They hated tyrants, especially Prussia. At the end of the 18th century, so around 1790, German public opinion was unanimously opposed to the ancient regime, as it was in France on the eve of the Revolution. They didn't care when the French annexed the left bank of the Rhine, and Austria and Prussia were defeated. They wanted parliamentary government. They got disillusioned. There's an upheaval in Germany in 1848. So people weren't interested in the Romantics for a return to the Middle Ages. They wanted parliamentary activities. They read Goethe and Schiller. Schiller was devoted to liberty. German liberalism was unable to cope with the armies of Austria and Prussia. Right? People wanted democracy, but there were armies that stopped them by violence, by force, by threat of force. Regarding the Prussian army, Frederick II begins his main treatise of strategy with 14 rules on how to hinder desertion. Tactical and even strategic considerations had to be subordinated to the prevention of desertion. The troops could only be employed when tightly assembled together. Patrols could not be sent out. Strategic pursuit of a defeated enemy force was impossible. Marching or attacking at night and camping near forests was strictly avoided. I thought all that was really interesting about how little control over their army people used to have. This is in the past. This is 1742. And this is an army where it's 2/3 foreigners and 1/3 native. So they used like deserters from foreign armies, prisoners of war, criminals, vagabonds, tramps, and people they managed to conscript. So largely people who didn't want to be there. And they used drilling and flogging, barbaric discipline, men pressed into service. So this is how old armies worked. And so these armies, because of their nature, there were limits on what they could do. And they had to put a lot of effort into preventing desertion. And they threatened the civilian populace with heavy penalties to make them help prevent desertion. And they only put noblemen in charge because they needed like control over the army. They couldn't trust it, so they have to put their people in charge. There were some foreign noblemen, but at least they were noblemen, and the greater number belonged to the Prussian Junker class, which is it's like nobles. Landed nobility, owned great estates, maintained and worked by peasants with few rights. A lot of the landed aristocracy, even though it was profitable to have a military career, didn't want their sons to do it, presumably because they didn't want them to die. So the kings used to send out policemen to kidnap the sons of noble landowners and put them into military schools. That's interesting. And they got hardly more than elementary school education, but they got, indoctrinated into the military. So the officers of the Prussian army, most of them didn't have higher education. They just knew how to fight and be barbaric and suppress desertion. So such an army, because of its limits, could beat similar armies. But it scattered when it had to fight Napoleon. The French Revolution armies recruited from the people. They were free men, not crimped scum. Their commanders didn't fear desertion, so they could change tactics. They could fight in columns and skirmish, and they got a bunch of advantages. So the Prussian army wanted to copy that. However, what we found out is only part of it would be loyal against a domestic foe. And it wouldn't do an unpopular war of aggression. When they suppressed the 1848 revolution, only regiments of the Royal Guards whose men were selected for their allegiance to the king, the cavalry and the regiments recruited from the eastern provinces, were considered absolutely reliable. The ones from the west and the reservants of some eastern regiments were too infected with liberal ideas to be loyal to do violence against whoever they were told to. I found all this stuff interesting. So they wanted to have longer training periods for conscripted people. Not to make them better soldiers, just to better indoctrinate them. So that they would attack anyone who they were told to without asking questions. So they changed from 2 years to 2.5, and then to 3 years for active service in the infantry. Not for technical military reasons, but for political considerations. They're trying to make the army stronger and more loyal. They made it bigger as well. Double infantry battalions. 25% more artillery. New cavalry. More yearly recruits. They also armed, and then, because there was a potential conflict, and then after they demobilized, they then asked Parliament to vote for the spending, the money, to fund what they had already done. And the struggle against this army bill was the last political act of German liberalism. So the liberals were losing. Parliament was weak. It wasn't able to control these things that the king and the aristocracy were doing. So the constitutional conflict in Prussia. The progressives, as the liberals in the Prussian lower chamber called their party, opposed the reform. They voted against the bill and against the budget. Frederick had died and William I came and dissolved Parliament, but the electors returned a majority of progressives. So he basically threw out the people in the government and had a new election, but then the population voted for liberals again, who wouldn't fund the military bill. So they had 2 new army campaigns anyways. They defeated Denmark and Austria. They annexed a bunch of territory. And finally, some of the liberals supported the government, and the king got a majority to approve everything he'd done for the last 6 years. So liberalism lost the political battle in Germany then. So the German liberals in the 60s, the 1860s, knew what had gone wrong. You can't establish a popular government with a nation where many millions were still caught in the bonds of superstition, boorishness, and illiteracy. The political problem was essentially a problem of education. The final success of liberalism and democracy was beyond doubt because it was rational and reasonable and made sense. But the victory of liberalism could be achieved only when those strata of the population from which the king drew his reliable soldiers should become enlightened. So they had to educate the country. That was the idea, but it didn't work out that way. They thought that over time, their ideas would spread and they would win. And we ended up with the Nazis instead at a later time, because new ideas were created and spread, such as socialism and nationalism. Well, nationalism is not new, but certain variants of it or parts of it. So the liberals thought they were getting closer to the point where the king couldn't use his army against the people because people are getting more educated. But LaSalle said, the state is God. And some ideas along those lines became popular. So, chapter 2, the triumph of militarism. The Prussian army in the new German Empire. In 1870, the German princes won a battle. And they finally had an army of unquestionable reliability, which could quell rebellions and revolutions. The political problem of the 50s and early 60s, the problem of the reliability of the soldiers, had vanished. German soldiers were now unconditionally loyal to the supreme warlord. He told his recruits that it was their duty to fire upon their fathers, mothers, brothers, or sisters if he ordered them to. Speeches like that were criticized by the liberals, but the liberals were powerless. The allegiance of the soldiers was absolute. It no longer depended on length of active service. And the army itself returned the conscription duration to 2 years. Okay, why did this happen? I'm going to go back a bit because I didn't highlight an explanation. LaSalle proclaimed class war. He said the liberals were representatives of the bourgeoisie, the mortal foes of labor. You shouldn't fight the state, but the exploiting class, as the state is your friend. Of course, not the one controlled by Bismarck, but the state as controlled by LaSalle. So the ideas of socialism and statism appeared on the political scene to oppose liberalism and freedom. LaSalle wasn't a Nazi, but he was a forerunner of Nazis. He was the first German who aimed at the Führer position for himself. He rejected the Enlightenment values and liberal philosophy, but not as a romantic eulogist of the Middle Ages, and not as a royalist. He negated them. He promised at the same time to realize them in a fuller and broader sense, like real freedom. Right, he'll bring true freedom. And the means of true freedom was the omnipotent government. It's not the police who are foes of liberty, it's the bourgeoisie. So these ideas spread to the lower classes. Like the more middle class people were more into ideas and learned about liberalism, and then the more peasant class was fooled by these ideas. So the criticism of liberalism and the work of the royalists to make their army more loyal worked out for them. So they got to the point where they could tell people, shoot your brother if I order you to. That's your duty. So people didn't want to start a revolution anymore because they would be killed. And so the Congress, the Parliament, something like that, had to basically do whatever they were told and fund the army because they had no power. With the expansion of the armed forces, it had long become impossible to give commissions to noblemen only. The number of non-aristocratic officers steadily grew. The generals were not ready to admit into the ranks of commissioned officers on active duty any but those commoners of good and wealthy families. I think it's interesting how biased that was and how that worked. So it says that was an even bigger problem than finances for increasing the army. The liberals also criticized military policy, and the army generals said, you guys have no idea what you're talking about regarding military problems. Even officers, so people who actually knew about the military, who had retired, who said anything negative about the military, were called biased partisans. Public opinion at last acknowledged the general staff's claim to infallibility, and all critics were silenced. Events of World War I proved, of course, that these critics had a better grasp of military methods than the specialists of the general staff. I thought that was amusing. But yeah, in World War I, the German military leaders demonstrated they weren't as good at things as they thought they were, and a lot of their critics had been correct. So the liberals realized that they needed to educate and persuade the nation, not to have a majority of liberals in the chamber of government, but a liberal majority among the people, and especially in the army, so that the army would be unwilling to murder the liberals to prevent them from ever getting power. They needed to bring into the ranks of liberalism the backward, ignorant masses whose political indifference was the safeguard of absolutism. Then they could have popular government and democracy. So there were some political changes that were bad for the liberals, but they didn't care that much because they thought what they needed to do was educate the country. The liberals did not greatly fear socialism. Why should the wage earners, whose standard of living was daily improving, be deluded by demagogues who were rumored to be on the payroll of Bismarck? However, there is a change taking place in the nation's mentality. The liberals thought it was a temporary setback, a reactionary incident, that the supporters of socialism were misguided or renegade. But the numbers increased. The youth no longer joined the Liberal Party. The old fighters for liberalism grew tired. With every new election campaign, their ranks became thinner. Every year, the reactionary system, which they hated, became more powerful. Some men still clung to liberty and democracy, fighting the assaults from the right and the left. They were forlorn. The liberals died out. The new generation did not even know the meaning of the word. It's sad. Like, people... The world was sort of bad, and then people came up with some better ideas, and they started making progress, and they were working on educating people, and then some new bad ideas came along and, like, indoctrinated people instead, and they got confused. And it led to the world wars, among many other really, really bad things.